My father used a golden ruler to measure our feet daily and would re-break the bones if they grew past 3 inches, because he said women with lotus feet were more valuable, so he bound me and my sister until my feet rotted off from infection and had to be amputated. But even then, he tried to convince the doctors to bind my prosthetics into the shape of tiny feet, while making my sister practice her lotus walk on stumps where her toes used to be. My culture had one rule: the smaller a woman's feet, the more valuable she is. So my dad took it upon himself to make sure all his daughters, including me, had perfectly bound lotus feet. 3-inch golden lotuses were the ideal, and anything larger was grotesque. He'd measure us daily with a special golden ruler, and if our feet showed signs of growing despite the bindings, he'd break them again himself. Dad had always obsessed over feminine perfection. He'd measure mom's feet monthly, disappointed they were 4 inches despite being bound since childhood. He made her wear tiny embroidered shoes that barely contained her folded feet, saying, "A beautiful woman suffers silently for her elegance." He collected hundreds of these shoes, displaying them in glass cases like precious jewels. When I turned 5, he started my binding, promising I'd be the most beautiful daughter with the tiniest feet anyone had ever seen. I still remember that first night, the sound of my own bones cracking, my childish voice begging him to stop, the way he smiled and said this was love. Mom never defended us. She'd been praised for her lotus gait as a young bride, that swaying walk that men found so alluring, never mentioning it came from bones folded in half. Her own mother had bound her feet at age 3, and she'd won beauty contests in her village before marrying Dad. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at her own mangled feet with tears in her eyes, but she'd quickly look away. When my sister Mei Ling turned 6, Dad measured her feet and flew into a rage. They were already too big. "No man will want a wife with peasant feet," he screamed. He hired a professional foot binder, an old woman who specialized in late corrections, breaking and rebinding feet that had grown too much. She brought special binding cloth soaked in herbs and animal blood, following ancient recipes. Mei Ling screamed for 3 days straight as the woman folded her feet tighter and tighter, Dad reminding her that beauty requires sacrifice. I held her hand through it all, both of us sobbing, her fingernails digging into my palm as each bone snapped. Living in that house meant constant measurement and comparison. Dad kept charts of our foot sizes, celebrating each lost millimeter. My feet shrank from breaking and binding until they were barely 3 inches. Dad threw a party, saying I'd achieved golden lotus perfection. But the smaller they got, the more excruciating life became. Walking on feet folded completely in half, toes tucked under, bones grinding against each other with each step. Dad would parade us before his friends, making us remove our shoes so they could admire our tiny feet. They'd nod approvingly, saying we'd make fine wives, that our husbands would treasure such perfect lotus feet. One man offered to arrange my marriage to his son, impressed that at 14, my feet were smaller than a child's shoe. I wanted to scream that I was a child, that these weren't feet anymore but mangled stumps, but I just smiled through the tears, because speaking up meant more binding. The binding process never stopped. Every few days, Dad would inspect and retighten, breaking any new bone growth. He'd measure obsessively. Mei Ling's feet had stopped at 4 inches, and he considered her a failure. Mine were approaching 2.5 inches, bones so compressed they were fusing together. Dad said I was his masterpiece. We competed in local lotus feet contests, where fathers would display their daughters' tiny feet. Dad would oil my feet until they shone, dress them in silk shoes the size of doll accessories. Judges would measure and examine, praising the arch, the fold, the way my toes had completely disappeared under the foot. I won every time, Dad glowing with pride while I stood trembling from pain. Each trophy felt like a monument to my torture. The infection started when I was 15. The folds were so deep, so compressed, that flesh began to rot between the layers. But Dad said the smell was the perfume of beauty, and bound them tighter to hide the decay. Mei Ling developed blood poisoning, her feet turning black, but Dad just worried it would make them look larger. One day, I collapsed at another beauty contest. The infection had reached my bloodstream. When the judges tried to help, they unwrapped my feet and recoiled. Beneath the silk was rotting flesh, bones protruding through skin, toes that had necrotized completely. What they'd been judging as perfect golden lotuses were literally dying appendages. The hospital had to amputate both feet below the ankles. They said another week and I would have died from sepsis. Mei Ling lost most of her toes. They found Mom's feet were similarly infected after decades in tiny shoes. Dad tried to convince the doctors this was about preserving beauty traditions, that we'd be worthless women without our lotus feet. Even as I lay there with no feet at all, he wept not for my pain, but because I'd lost my beauty. He actually asked the doctors if they could bind my prosthetics. The court was horrified. Dad had turned an extinct practice into modern child torture, all for his obsession with an ancient beauty standard. He'd destroyed his daughters' bodies for the sake of 3-inch feet, and I was ready to make sure he'd never walk again. The doctor explained that I'd need months of physical therapy to learn to walk with prosthetics. Dad interrupted to ask if they made decorative covers that could make the prosthetics look smaller. The medical team exchanged horrified glances as he pulled out his golden ruler, trying to measure where my feet used to be. During my first week in the hospital, Dad visited daily with shoe catalogs. He'd flip through pages of tiny embroidered slippers, lamenting that I'd never wear his collection again. He brought silk wrappings and tried to convince the nurses to bind the stumps to maintain their shape. Security had to escort him out when he attempted to wrap the bandages himself. Mom sat silently in the corner during these visits, her own infected feet hidden in oversized hospital slippers. The doctors had prescribed antibiotics and special treatments, but she refused to remove her tiny shoes in front of Dad. I watched her shift uncomfortably, saw the pain flash across her face with each movement. Mei Ling occupied the bed next to mine. They'd managed to save her feet, but most of her toes were gone. She stared at the bandages constantly, occasionally trying to wiggle toes that no longer existed. Dad had brought her a pair of children's shoes, insisting she'd fit into them once the swelling went down. The physical therapist arrived on my third day. She unwrapped my stumps gently, examining the healing tissue. Dad immediately started critiquing the amputation job, saying they'd left too much ankle, that it would make me look thick-legged. The therapist's face went rigid as she rewrapped the bandages. That afternoon, a social worker came to discuss our living situation. Dad dominated the conversation, explaining his traditional values and how he'd raised us with classical beauty standards. He showed her photos from the lotus feet contests, pointing out my trophies. She took notes with trembling hands. The prosthetic specialist measured my residual limbs the following week. Dad hovered nearby, asking about custom options. Could they make the prosthetic feet smaller than normal? Could they be shaped to look like bound feet? Could they add an arch that mimicked the lotus curve? Each question made the specialist's jaw clench tighter. When they brought my first set of prosthetics, Dad's face fell. They were functional, normal-sized feet. He immediately started planning modifications, sketching designs for decorative covers that would create the illusion of tiny feet. He even contacted a cobbler about making special shoes that would compress the prosthetics. Learning to stand took days. My body had adapted to walking on folded feet for so long that normal positioning felt alien. Dad criticized my stance, saying I'd lost my lotus gait. He demonstrated the swaying walk he expected, the one that had crippled Mom and countless women before her. Mei Ling started physical therapy too. With most of her toes gone, balance was nearly impossible. Dad made her practice the traditional walk anyway, forcing her to sway and mince despite the missing digits. When she fell, he blamed her for not trying hard enough to maintain grace. The hospital social worker returned with a court advocate. They interviewed each of us separately, documenting years of abuse. Dad waited outside, pacing and muttering about government interference in family traditions. When they spoke to Mom, she initially defended him, reciting phrases about beauty and sacrifice. But something shifted when they asked about her own binding. Mom slowly removed her shoes, revealing feet so deformed that several nurses had to leave the room. The advocate photographed the overlapping toes, the deep crevices where infection festered, the bones visible through paper-thin skin. Mom sobbed as she admitted the constant agony. Dad's response to the investigation was to double down. He arrived the next day with a suitcase full of binding supplies, announcing he'd hired a specialist to help Mei Ling's feet heal properly. Hospital security intercepted him at the elevator. He shouted about his rights as a father, about preserving culture, about raising valuable daughters. The nurses started limiting his visits. He'd sneak in during shift changes, leaving notes about maintaining our beauty routines. One morning I woke to find him trying to paint my toenails on feet that no longer existed. He'd brought bottles of red polish, the color he'd always insisted made feet look smaller. Physical therapy progressed slowly. Each step on the prosthetics sent shooting pains through my legs. My body struggled to adjust after years of balancing on folded bones. Dad watched from the doorway when he could, shaking his head at my masculine gait. The horror of this tradition being twisted into modern torture is beyond words. That golden ruler measuring their agony, those tiny shoes hiding rotting flesh, a father who sees beauty in his daughter's broken bones. He'd call out corrections, telling me to make my steps daintier. The occupational therapist worked with all three of us. Mom had to relearn basic walking without the tiny shoes. Her feet had been bound for over 30 years. The muscles had atrophied, the bones fused in unnatural positions. Dad tried to bring her new small shoes, insisting she needed to maintain her elegant appearance. Mei Ling's progress frustrated him most. Without toes, she'd never achieved the mincing steps he treasured. He blamed the doctors for removing too much, said they should have just treated the infection and preserved the aesthetic. He brought medical textbooks, pointing out alternative procedures that might have saved her lotus feet. The court date approached. Dad hired a lawyer who specialized in cultural preservation cases. They prepared a defense around tradition and parental rights. He gathered testimonials from other fathers who'd bound their daughters' feet, though most were from decades past. He created a presentation about the historical significance of lotus feet. During this time, I overheard him on the phone with relatives. He complained about the Western doctors who didn't understand beauty. He rallied support from elderly aunts who'd had their own feet bound, getting them to write letters about the honor it brought their families. He even contacted museums, trying to position himself as a cultural preservationist. The hospital became our sanctuary. Nurses would warn us when Dad approached, giving us time to prepare. They taught us to advocate for ourselves, to say no to his demands. But years of conditioning ran deep. When he commanded us to sit a certain way or criticized our appearance, we still found ourselves automatically obeying. One evening, Dad arrived with a photographer. He wanted to document our transformation, to show how the hospital had destroyed traditional beauty. He tried to position us for photos, arranging our bodies to hide the amputations and bandages. The nursing staff intervened, but not before he'd taken several pictures. Mom's breaking point came when Dad brought her a new pair of shoes. They were even smaller than her previous ones, meant to compress her infected feet further. As he tried to force them on, she screamed, not from pain, but from rage. Decades of silent suffering erupted as she threw the shoes at him, sobbing about the daughters he'd destroyed. His response was to blame the hospital for turning us against him. He accused the staff of brainwashing, of destroying our family values. He threatened to move us to a private facility where he could oversee our care properly. The social worker expedited the protection orders after that conversation. The day I took my first independent steps on prosthetics, Dad wasn't there. The court had restricted his visits to supervised sessions only, but I could still hear his voice in my head, criticizing my posture, lamenting the loss of my lotus gait. The physical therapist had to remind me repeatedly that walking normally wasn't a failure. Mei Ling and I started meeting with a counselor. She helped us understand that Dad's obsession wasn't love, but control. We learned about body autonomy, about the difference between cultural appreciation and abuse. Each session revealed new layers of manipulation we'd internalized as normal. Mom joined our sessions eventually. Her own childhood trauma emerged. Stories of her mother breaking her feet repeatedly, of being praised for her suffering. She'd perpetuated the cycle because she'd never known anything else. The counselor worked with her on breaking free from decades of conditioning. As the court date neared, Dad's behavior escalated. He'd wait outside the hospital, following our medical transport vehicles. He left packages of tiny shoes at the reception desk. He sent letters describing how disappointed our ancestors would be. Each message reinforced his belief that he'd done nothing wrong, that society simply didn't understand true beauty. The prosecutor met with us to prepare testimony. Dad had assembled a team of defenders, including cultural anthropologists who argued for the preservation of traditions. He'd positioned himself as a victim of cultural persecution, claiming the government was attacking his heritage. His lawyer painted a picture of a devoted father maintaining ancient customs, but the medical evidence was overwhelming. X-rays showed the systematic destruction of our bones. Photographs documented the infections, the amputations, the permanent disabilities. The prosecutor had experts explain how Dad had taken an already harmful historical practice and weaponized it against his own children. Our final week in the hospital, Dad made one last attempt. He arrived with a traditional healer who claimed she could restore our feet through herbal treatments. Security stopped them at the entrance, but Dad shouted loud enough for us to hear. He promised to fix us, to make us beautiful again, to undo the damage the doctors had caused. That night, the three of us sat together in my room. Mom's feet were slowly healing, though she'd never walk normally. Mei Ling was learning to balance without toes. I was adjusting to life with prosthetics. We looked at old photos Dad had brought, pictures of us winning contests, our feet wrapped in silk and ribbons, our faces twisted in hidden pain. We made a pact that night. Whatever happened in court, we'd protect each other. We'd never let him near us again. We'd break the cycle that had destroyed generations of women in our family. As I practiced walking the hospital corridors, each step on my prosthetic feet felt like a small victory against everything Dad had tried to make us believe. The story was far from over. Dad still had supporters, still believed he'd done nothing wrong. The court case would be brutal. Recovery would take years. But for the first time in our lives, we were learning to stand on our own feet, even if some of those feet were now made of carbon fiber and titanium. The real fight for our freedom was just beginning. The rehabilitation wing became our battleground. Dad discovered the visiting schedule and arrived during every supervised session with new schemes. He brought architectural blueprints for modified prosthetics, designs that would force my artificial feet into lotus positions. The prosthetist refused to even look at them, but Dad left copies scattered across the therapy room. My first attempts at walking drew crowds of medical students. They documented my progress for research on extreme foot deformities. Dad pushed through them one morning, carrying a suitcase of miniature shoes he'd commissioned from a doll maker. He demonstrated how the prosthetics could be compressed into them, ignoring my therapist's protests about destroying my ability to walk. Mei Ling's recovery progressed differently. Without most of her toes, she developed a peculiar hopping gait. Dad filmed her movements obsessively, later showing us edited videos where he'd slowed down her steps to create an illusion of the traditional lotus walk. He distributed these videos to relatives as proof that the binding had been successful after all. The hospital administration implemented stricter security protocols. Dad responded by recruiting sympathizers from our extended family. My aunts began appearing during therapy sessions, elderly women with their own bound feet hidden in oversized slippers. They surrounded us during exercises, sharing stories about how their tiny feet had brought them good marriages and prosperity. One aunt, Benji's grandmother, cornered me in the hallway. She unwrapped her own feet to show me the pride she took in bones folded completely under, toes that had rotted away decades ago. She pressed photos into my hands of her wedding day, pointing out how her husband had carried her everywhere because she couldn't walk. This was romance, she insisted. This was a woman's value. Mom's transformation accelerated after that encounter. She began attending therapy sessions without Dad's knowledge, learning to walk in normal shoes for the first time since childhood. The physical therapist had to start with basic foot anatomy, explaining how feet were meant to function. Mom wept as she discovered she'd never known what her own feet should look like. Dad's response to Mom's independence was swift. He emptied their joint bank account and hired a private investigator to document her abandonment of traditional values. The investigator followed us to therapy sessions, photographing Mom's new shoes as evidence of her betrayal. Dad compiled these photos into a presentation for their divorce proceedings. The prosthetics team developed a special training program for me. They created a series of increasingly complex terrains to help me relearn balance. Dad infiltrated one session by posing as a janitor, spreading oil on the practice surfaces to make me fall. He wanted to prove I couldn't walk properly without the lotus gait. Security footage revealed Dad's sabotage. The hospital banned him completely, but he stationed himself across the street with binoculars. He documented every person who entered or left our ward, creating detailed logs of what he called co-conspirators in cultural destruction. These logs included nurses, doctors, cleaning staff, and even food service workers. Mei Ling developed phantom pain where her toes used to be. The doctors explained this was normal, but Dad sent letters claiming it was her feet trying to return to their proper bound position. He included diagrams showing how phantom limbs could be trained through meditation to resume their original shape. Mei Ling burned the letters, but the words haunted her dreams. Our counseling sessions revealed deeper trauma. The therapist helped us understand how Dad had weaponized our culture's history against us. She showed us academic papers about foot binding's abolishment in the early 1900s, how it had been outlawed for good reason. This father's descent into madness is breaking my heart, bringing doll shoes for prosthetic feet, hiring investigators to stalk his own family, even pretending to be a janitor to make his daughter fall. Dad had revived revived a dead practice, twisting it into something even more extreme than our ancestors had endured. The extended family began choosing sides. Dad's brothers supported him, sharing their own memories of their mother's bound feet. They brought photo albums showing generations of women with tiny feet, arguing this was our heritage. But younger cousins sided with us, horrified by what had been done in the name of tradition. Dad escalated by contacting international foot-binding historians. He wanted expert witnesses to testify about the cultural significance of the practice. Several historians responded with horror, explaining that even at its peak, foot-binding had never involved the extreme measures Dad had taken. He accused them of historical revisionism. Physical therapy introduced me to other amputees. They shared their stories of loss and recovery, none involving intentional mutilation by parents. Dad learned about these support group meetings and began leaving pamphlets outside the room about how Western medicine destroyed Eastern beauty standards. The other patients started escorting us to and from sessions for protection. Mom filed for divorce during my second month of recovery. Dad's lawyer argued she was mentally incompetent, corrupted by Western influence. As evidence, he presented photos of Mom's new shoes, each pair larger than the last as her feet slowly expanded without binding. The judge, however, was more interested in the medical records showing decades of infection. Dad's sister Victoria arrived from overseas, initially supporting him. She'd escaped foot binding by leaving the country young, but still believed in traditional values. Her perspective changed when she saw my prosthetics and Mei Ling's mangled feet. She confronted Dad in the hospital cafeteria, their argument echoing through 3 floors. The confrontation revealed family secrets. Victoria disclosed that their mother had tried to unbind her own feet after marriage, but their father had broken her ankles as punishment. This was why she died young from infection, not from the feminine disease Dad had always claimed. He accused Victoria of lying, but Mom confirmed she'd heard similar stories from Dad's aunts. Rehabilitation expanded beyond physical therapy. Occupational therapists taught me to navigate stairs, uneven surfaces, and various terrains with prosthetics. Dad hired a cultural consultant to argue that I should only need to walk on flat surfaces, as traditional women never left their homes. The consultant resigned after seeing my medical files. Mei Ling's progress inspired other patients. Her determination to walk despite missing toes became legendary in the ward. Dad tried to claim credit, saying his strict training had given her such strength. The medical staff created a wall of achievements for patients, pointedly excluding any mention of what had caused our injuries. The prosthetics underwent multiple adjustments. Each fitting required precise measurements and modifications. Dad attempted to bribe technicians to make them smaller, offering substantial sums to create lotus-shaped prosthetic feet. One technician reported him to hospital administration, leading to a restraining order. Mom discovered Dad had been collecting our discarded bandages. He'd stored them in a shrine-like room at home, along with the shoes we could no longer wear and photos from every stage of our binding. She documented everything for the divorce proceedings, showing how his obsession had consumed their entire home. Family meetings became battlegrounds. Dad's supporters grew fewer as medical evidence mounted. Even his brothers began questioning whether culture justified crippling children. Dad responded by creating a manifesto about preserving tradition against modern corruption. He distributed copies to every family member, demanding they choose between heritage and health. The manifesto backfired spectacularly. Younger relatives shared it on social media as an example of dangerous extremism. Dad tried to sue them for defamation, but lawyers refused his case. He began representing himself, filing increasingly bizarre legal documents about his right to beautify his daughters. Prosthetic training intensified as the court date approached. I needed to demonstrate mobility and independence. Dad hired photographers to capture my ungraceful attempts at walking, planning to use them as evidence that the amputations had failed. The photos instead showed my determination and progress. Mei Ling faced different challenges. Without toes, she needed special insoles and modifications. Dad intercepted a shipment of her custom shoes, replacing them with tiny slippers that would force her to walk on her heels. The deception was discovered when she tried them on and immediately fell. Mom's feet began healing remarkably once freed from binding. The circulation improved, infections cleared, and she gained 2 inches in height as her spine straightened. Dad saw this as deterioration, documenting what he called her descent into masculine presentation. He failed to notice her smile returning after decades. The hospital social worker connected us with other survivors of abuse. Though none had experienced foot binding, they understood parental betrayal and the long journey to recovery. Dad tried to infiltrate these meetings by sending elderly relatives who claimed to need support, but their bound feet gave them away. Training expanded to include self-defense. The therapists worried about Dad's escalating behavior and wanted us prepared. He discovered these sessions and filed complaints about the hospital teaching violence to women. The irony of his concern for our safety after destroying our feet was lost on him. Mei Ling and I developed our own communication system during recovery. We'd tap messages with our remaining toes or fingers, sharing fears and hopes Dad couldn't intercept. He noticed our secret language and demanded translation, convinced we were plotting against him. We were simply discussing our favorite hospital meals. Dad's isolation grew as his behavior became more erratic. Former friends distanced themselves after seeing the medical evidence. He responded by creating his own support group for fathers preserving culture, but only 2 people attended the first meeting. Both left after he showed them photos of our bound feet. The prosthetics team created a graduation ceremony for patients who achieved walking independence. Dad attempted to crash mine, carrying a banner about false achievements and mechanical deception. Security removed him, but not before other patients' families saw his signs. Their horror validated our experiences in ways sympathy never could. Mom's divorce lawyer uncovered financial records showing Dad had spent our college funds on foot binding supplies and beauty contests. He'd prioritized tiny shoes over our education education, believing small feet would secure wealthy husbands who'd support us. The judge added financial abuse to the growing list of charges. Physical milestones came slowly but steadily. I managed my first unassisted walk across the therapy room. Mei Ling balanced for 30 seconds without holding anything. Mom wore sneakers for the first time in 40 years. Each achievement felt monumental after years of restriction and pain. Dad's final attempt at control came through emotional manipulation. He sent letters describing his own childhood, how his mother's tiny feet had been the family's pride. He claimed we were destroying generations of tradition, breaking his heart. The letters might have worked once, but therapy had taught us to recognize manipulation. The extended family held an intervention, but not the kind Dad expected. They confronted him about the abuse, presenting medical evidence and testimony from healthcare workers. He sat silently through 3 hours of pleas to seek help, then stood and declared them all traitors to their heritage. Recovery meant more than physical healing. We learned to set boundaries, to say no without fear. Dad tested these constantly, showing up at therapy with gifts and apologies that always circled back to foot binding. We learned to walk away, literally and figuratively, on feet that finally worked as feet should. The court date loomed as Dad made increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. He hired actors to pose as cultural experts, created fake historical documents, and even attempted to bribe court officials. Each scheme unraveled, adding to the evidence against him. His obsession had consumed everything, even his grip on reality. Our final family dinner before court was surreal. Dad sat at the head of the table, critiquing everyone's posture and gait as if nothing had changed. He'd prepared a presentation about our family's foot-binding legacy, complete with charts showing size reduction across generations. We left before dessert, walking out on legs that could finally carry us away. The prosecutor met with us one last time to review testimony. Dad had submitted hundreds of pages defending his actions, citing obscure texts and misinterpreted traditions. But the medical evidence spoke louder than any cultural argument. X-rays showed the systematic destruction he'd inflicted in pursuit of an impossible ideal. That night, I stood on my prosthetic feet and looked at myself in the mirror. The carbon fiber and titanium were obvious, but they were mine. They carried me forward instead of holding me back. Tomorrow we'd face Dad in court, but tonight, for the first time, I stood tall without shame or pain. The morning of the court hearing arrived with Dad attempting one final manipulation. He'd convinced an elderly uncle to wheel him into the courthouse in a wheelchair, claiming emotional distress had left him unable to walk. The irony wasn't lost on anyone as I navigated the courthouse steps on prosthetic feet while he pretended disability for sympathy. Inside the courtroom, Dad's supporters filled one side. This courtroom showdown is shaking me to my core. A father who destroyed his daughter's feet now sits in a wheelchair pretending to be hurt himself. The pure cruelty of him using fake disability for sympathy while his daughter walks on metal feet because of what he did makes me mad, bro. Ancient aunts with bound feet hidden in oversized shoes, uncles who remembered their mother's tiny steps, cousins who'd grown up hearing stories of feminine beauty. They clutched photos of ancestors with lotus feet, ready to testify about tradition and honor. Our side held a different crowd. Medical professionals who'd treated our infections, physical therapists who'd taught us to walk again, the prosthetist who'd crafted my new feet. Mei Ling sat between Mom and me, her special shoes visible beneath her dress. Mom wore sneakers, her feet finally beginning to resemble their natural shape after months without binding. Dad's lawyer opened with a passionate defense of cultural preservation. He displayed historical artifacts, quoted ancient texts, showed paintings of women with bound feet from centuries past. He painted Dad as a devoted father trying to maintain family traditions in a world that had forgotten its heritage. The prosecutor responded with X-rays, image after image of destroyed bones, compressed beyond recognition, infections that had nearly unalived us. The courtroom fell silent as she explained how Dad had taken a practice abandoned for good reason and pushed it to extremes our ancestors never imagined. When Dad took the stand, he brought his golden ruler. He demonstrated proper measuring techniques, explained the ideal proportions, described the beauty of a perfect lotus foot. He never once acknowledged the wheelchair I needed to attend court or Mei Ling's specially modified shoes. The medical testimony was devastating. Doctors explained how I'd been hours from death when the infection reached my bloodstream. They showed photos of the amputation, the rotted flesh they'd removed, the bones that had fused into impossible angles. One surgeon testified that in 30 years of practice, he'd never seen intentional damage this severe. Dad's response was to accuse the doctors of cultural ignorance. He produced letters from elderly women praising their own bound feet, testimonials about happy marriages secured by tiny feet. He insisted the doctors had overreacted, that proper traditional treatment could have saved our lotus feet while treating the infection. Mei Ling's testimony came next. She stood carefully, balancing on her partial feet, and demonstrated her walking ability. Dad watched with critical eyes, shaking his head at her imperfect gait. When she described the pain of having her toes amputated, he muttered about aesthetic loss loud enough for everyone to hear. Mom's testimony revealed decades of hidden suffering. She removed her shoes in court, showing feet that barely resembled human appendages even after months of healing. She described sleeping in tiny shoes because Dad insisted beauty never rested. She talked about infections treated with herbs instead of medicine, bones rebroken when they tried to heal naturally. Dad interrupted to insist Mom had been proud of her feet, that she'd won contests and received compliments. He pulled out photos of her as a young bride, pointing out her tiny shoes, her lotus gait, the way she'd needed assistance to walk. He couldn't understand why she wasn't grateful for the beauty he'd given her. My testimony came last. I walked to the stand on prosthetic feet, each step deliberate and steady. Dad watched with disgust as I moved with normal strides instead of the mincing steps he'd trained into me. I described years of pain, the daily breaking of bones, the infections that had finally cost me my feet. I explained how he'd made us compete against each other, how Mei Ling's 4-inch feet made her a failure in his eyes while my approaching 2-inch feet made me his masterpiece. I talked about the beauty contests where judges measured our deformities, where fathers displayed their daughters' disabilities as achievements. The prosecutor presented Dad's collection as evidence. Hundreds of tiny shoes, each pair smaller than the last. Charts tracking our foot size reduction with celebratory notes for each lost millimeter. Photos from every stage of binding, including close-ups of infected feet he'd labeled as achieving ideal compression, the golden ruler he'd used to measure our torture. Dad's elderly supporters began leaving during the evidence presentation. Seeing the medical reality of what he'd done, the extremes he'd taken their cultural memories to, shook their faith. Even his brothers looked uncomfortable as photo after photo showed the systematic destruction of their nieces' bodies. Victoria testified about family history Dad had hidden. She revealed that multiple women in previous generations had died from foot binding infections, deaths Dad had attributed to other causes. She presented letters from relatives who'd escaped the practice, describing it as torture even in its traditional form. Dad's lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, suggesting Dad's cultural upbringing had impaired his judgment, but the prosecutor presented evidence of Dad's meticulous planning, his research into binding techniques, his calculated escalation when traditional methods weren't extreme enough for his standards. The judge's questions were pointed. He asked Dad directly if he understood that I'd lost my feet. Dad responded by explaining how prosthetics could be modified to look like bound feet. The judge asked if he understood Mei Ling would never walk normally. Dad suggested special shoes could create the illusion of a lotus gait. When asked if he felt remorse, Dad launched into a speech about cultural destruction. He accused the court of participating in Western colonization of Eastern values. He insisted future generations would thank him for preserving tradition. He never once expressed concern for our pain or permanent disabilities. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts of child abuse, assault, and endangerment. Dad's response was to stand and declare the court illegitimate, insisting no Western institution could judge Eastern cultural practices. Security had to restrain him as he tried to approach us with his golden ruler. Sentencing brought maximum penalties: prison time, mandatory psychiatric treatment, permanent restraining orders. Dad would never come near us again. He screamed about appeals as they led him away, still clutching his golden ruler, still insisting we'd been perfect before the doctors ruined us. Outside the courthouse, Dad's remaining supporters waited with signs about cultural preservation. But when they saw me walking on prosthetic feet, saw Mei Ling's careful steps, saw Mom's feet in normal shoes for the first time, their protests faltered. Reality stood before them on feet that could finally function. The extended family fractured completely. Those who'd supported Dad distanced themselves, ashamed of their role in enabling abuse. Younger relatives reached out with apologies and support. Victoria became our fiercest advocate, using her story to warn others about disguising abuse as tradition. We returned to the hospital for follow-up appointments. The same hallways where Dad had stalked us now felt safe. Medical staff who'd witnessed his harassment celebrated the verdict with us. The prosthetist presented me with new feet, upgraded models that would last longer and function better. Physical therapy continued with renewed purpose. Without Dad's interference, I progressed rapidly. My gait became natural, my balance improved, my confidence grew. The therapist removed all the photos Dad had taken of my ungraceful walking and replaced them with milestone celebrations. Mei Ling's recovery accelerated too. Special insoles and modifications helped her achieve stability. She'd never have the balance she might have had with intact feet, but she could walk, run, dance. Everything Dad had said she'd never do again, she did with determination that came from freedom. Mom's transformation was most dramatic. Years of conditioning fell away as she learned to walk without pain. Her spine straightened, adding inches to her height. She discovered activities she'd never imagined possible: hiking, dancing, simply standing without agony. Each achievement was a rebellion against decades of restriction. The divorce finalized quickly with Dad imprisoned. Mom reclaimed assets he'd hidden, money spent on binding supplies and beauty contests. She sold his collection of tiny shoes to a museum studying the history of foot binding, using the proceeds for our medical expenses. We moved to a new house, one without display cases for tiny shoes or charts tracking foot measurements. Mom chose it specifically for its lack of memories, its distance from relatives who'd enabled Dad, its proximity to our medical team. We decorated with photos of our recovery milestones instead of beauty contest trophies. Dad's letters from prison arrived weekly at first. He wrote about maintaining traditions behind bars, teaching other inmates about cultural beauty standards, planning his appeal strategy. We returned them unopened. Eventually, the prison stopped forwarding them after he violated communication restrictions. Some relatives attempted reconciliation, bringing gifts and apologies. We accepted the genuine ones, those who truly understood the abuse they'd witnessed. But others came with subtle suggestions that we'd overreacted, that Dad meant well, that tradition mattered. We learned to close the door on those conversations. Recovery expanded beyond physical healing. We discovered activities impossible with bound feet. I joined a hiking group, tackling trails that would have been death sentences on lotus feet. Mei Ling took up martial arts, finding balance and strength in movement. Mom learned to drive, no longer dependent on others for mobility. The prosthetics became part of me. I decorated them sometimes, not to hide their function, but to celebrate it. Where Dad had seen shame in normal-sized feet, I saw freedom. Where he'd valued restriction and pain, I chose movement and strength. Each step forward was a choice he'd tried to steal from us. 6 months after the trial, we held our own ceremony, not to display tiny feet or celebrate restriction, but to honor survival. We burned the binding cloths Mom had saved, watched silk and tradition turn to ash. The golden ruler went last, melting into nothing, taking its measurements of torture with it. Life settled into new rhythms. Morning stretches to maintain flexibility. Regular Regular prosthetic adjustments as I grew. Physical therapy to strengthen what remained. Normal activities that had once been impossible. We were 3 women learning to walk, not with lotus gaits, but with purpose and strength. The last photo Dad had taken of my perfect lotus feet sat in an evidence box somewhere, 2.5 inches of crushed bones and rotting flesh, wrapped in silk and praised as beauty. Now I walked on titanium and carbon fiber, each step covering more ground than those bound feet ever could. The only measurement that mattered was the distance forward. We never spoke of visiting Dad in prison. There was nothing left to say to a man who wept for tiny feet while his daughters learned to walk again. He'd chosen tradition over family, beauty over health, control over love. We chose healing, chose freedom, chose feet that actually worked as feet should work. Our story ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with simple daily victories. Mom walking to the market in comfortable shoes, Mei Ling dancing at a cousin's wedding, me hiking mountain trails on prosthetic feet, 3 women who'd survived lotus feet, finally free to walk our own paths. And thanks for reading this story with me. I will see you in the next one.